Hello and welcome to the Mindset Game podcast. I'm Vered Kogan, and I'm absolutely honored to have Dr. Roger Nelson here with us today. Dr. Nelson is the director of the Global Consciousness Project, or GCP for short. He studied physics and sculpture at the University of Rochester, as well as studying experimental psychology at New York University and Columbia. He is the author and co-author of 100 technical papers and 3 books, one of which is titled Connected, The Emergence of Global Consciousness, which is excellent, and 2 others are in German. He was professor of psychology at Johnson State University in Northern Vermont, and in 1980 joined Princeton University's PAIR Lab to coordinate research. And for those of you who are not yet familiar, PAIR stands for Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research. His focus is on mental interactions, anomalous information transfer, and effects on random systems by individuals and groups. He created the Global Consciousness Project in 1997, building a world-spanning random number generator network designed to gather evidence of coalescing global consciousness. Thank you so much, Dr. Nelson, for being here with us today.
It's my great pleasure. Very nice to meet you, Barry.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Nelson. I followed your work for years, and just as I said, this is an absolute delight to have this conversation with you, because I truly believe that it has that the research that you have done and that the work that continues to be done has a tremendous impact on the future of humanity. And so let's begin by starting with, how do you define consciousness and global consciousness?
Oh my. Consciousness is an extremely complex and wondrous kind of issue, or entity. Maybe it's an entity. Consciousness is, in one sense, that which allows us to be aware of where we are, who we are, and what's going on around us. But consciousness from other perspectives may be something that's more fundamental than that. There are plenty of our brightest minds who consider that consciousness is rather fundamental. It's something out of which the rest of the world arises. And I think that definition is very sensible in a certain way, because it's real. I mean, the universe is conscious, and we are a manifestation of the consciousness of the universe. And it's just a marvelous privilege to be human, because humans are sufficiently complicated in terms of the consciousness that we manifest. We can actually be what people call self-aware. We can consider a question like, what's consciousness? In a sense, this is my favorite definition. Consciousness is that which allows us to ask the question.
So,
ask about global consciousness. Well, global consciousness is, from my perspective, global consciousness is the thing that Teilhard de Chardin, a Jesuit priest and scientist, he was a paleontologist, who wrote beautifully about the future of man. That's one of his book titles in English. The phenomenon of man is an absolutely splendid description of who we are and where we came from, what is evolution altogether. And at some point, having given a background, he says, our destiny, the next station in our evolution, is to become a consciousness for the whole world. He called it a noosphere. That's a sphere of thought and knowing around the planet, just like an atmosphere, except this one is made of this ethereal stuff that we think of as conscious thought. So, in a way, it's my personal opinion that he was completely, absolutely correct. He knew exactly what he was talking about, and and I believe that we are on the way to becoming exactly that he was talking about, a consciousness for the earth. It doesn't look like it most of the time if you watch the news, but we are moving slowly. We're becoming more aware of each other at a certain kind of electromechanical level. We have news, we have telephones, we have ways of communicating across the whole planet. Eventually, I think that will lead us to understand how important it is that we come together to think about the whole planet and to become um, stewards of the planet instead of well, some of the religions say our role is to have dominion over the birds and the beasts and the planet, but that we have misunderstood that, and what we really need is to not dominate, but to cooperate and collaborate to make this planet as beautiful as its potential is. We have a great deal of potential, and we should know more about that. It's my mission, I guess, to give people a little bit more insight into how powerful we are and how magnificent could be the world that we can create.
Thank you, Dr. Nelson. I really respect that mission, and I think that it is much needed. And would you be willing to share with our audience kind of the basics of the Global Consciousness Project and what you've seen in the research around this kind of coalescing global consciousness?
Well, when I was working for something like 10 years at the Pear Lab, asking, does consciousness reside just inside our heads, or can it reach out and touch the world? And the answer to that question, delivered from all kinds of experiments, is that we do live not just inside our skin, inside the skull, but this mind, the consciousness that we're talking about, really has a home in the world. We reach out and touch each other sometimes in a fashion that is magnificent and mysterious. We sometimes know more about what the other person is thinking than he or she might have said. We fall in love and become a kind of unit, which is no longer the same as the two separate beings, but something that combines the wonders of the separate parts. So anyway, we use, among other things, what are called random number generators, or random event generators, in the lab. What those devices are, it amounts to something like my wife says, just say it's like a high-speed electronic coin flipper. So we're flipping coins electronically very fast, and so we can accumulate long sequences of what should be heads, tails, without any predictability. That's a random sequence. We actually gather more than just one coin flip every second. We gather 200 coin flips every second. And what we asked people in the experiments with random number generators like that to do is to get bigger numbers than you should by chance. If you flip 200 coins, about half of them should be heads and half should be tails. So we should get a number like 100 if we flip to 200 electronic coins, or maybe 102 or 108 or 94. And so we asked people, try to get bigger numbers in one condition in the experiment. Try to get lower numbers in another part of the experiment. And let the machine alone. Just let it do what it does by itself. in the third condition. So in these three conditions, we have the intention in the person's mind, which reaches out into the world and somehow manages to make that machine produce higher numbers when that's the intention, or lower numbers. And also it produces what we call baselines. It doesn't go up, doesn't go down. It kind of wanders around in a level fashion. So what we asked was for people, just by thinking about it, just by wishing for it, to change the behavior of these random number generators. I'm telling such a long story, but I have to tell another step before we get to the global consciousness application. At one point, we were able to take data continuously, and we had also, in the meantime, miniaturized the random number generator. We started with things like a suitcase, and they're really high quality devices. We miniaturized to the point where we have one this long, which we could put on a miniature computer. People think of a cell phone, and put that in our pockets and go to really interesting places like rituals by people doing pagan stuff in the woods, and they're very serious. And maybe they come together in an intentional group and become a little bit different. They become a group instead of being separate individuals. Go to a church, go to the racetrack, go to a sporting event, or go to a concert or the opera, and take one of these devices along. So we began doing experiments in the field on what we were thinking of as fields of consciousness. We predicted that when a group really comes together, becomes coherent and resonant, and sharing some emotions or ideas, and rituals do this for us rather naturally. That's what rituals are for, is to bring us together, to combine us into a group. So we're asking, is there a group consciousness? And can we detect its presence by running these random number generators, which, remember, we have already shown are sensitive to something like the mind or the consciousness of people trying to do something. There's a little difference, though. In the group consciousness experiments, we basically, most of the people in the group, maybe only one or two who happen to be carrying these devices, knew anything about the experiment. And so the group consciousness was kind of, doing its normal thing, pure. It wasn't trying to do anything to the random number generators. Nevertheless, the data from which normally just wanders along in what we call a random walk becomes less random and starts diverging upward or downward from what should be the expected trend. Okay, so now you can see the next stage is the Global Consciousness Project, using a large dozens of these things spread around the world and doing exactly the same kind of group consciousness experiment, where we would predict that instead of being just random, they would begin to show a little bit of structure in the data. So this is a kind of really large group consciousness, namely, not ever do all the people in the world share emotions or ideas, but sometimes when big events occur, that really large numbers, millions of people actually be thinking the same thoughts, and more importantly, feeling the same emotion, which might be things like fear or anger, but also might be things like love and compassion. And so we set up a network of these things, sending data back to Princeton continuously, all day long, 7 days a week, 24/7, as they say. And we now have 25 years of continuous data from the Global Consciousness Network. And we just simply ask, if there's a big event in the world, do we see any indication of an effect in the data, a structure where there shouldn't be any, and these random data coming from the network? And the answer, once again, is yes. To the surprise of many, these devices, which, they're just an electromechanical, real solid little piece of electronics producing these numbers, their behavior changes slightly, and they become correlated with each other. Fashion is maybe a little bit like the correlation of people's thoughts with each other when they come together.
Fascinating. And so tell us a little bit more about some of these events, these massive events that you have noticed some, shift in the randomness of those random number generators.
Right. We tried to identify things that were happening on the world stage, which would attract the attention and maybe stir the emotions of large numbers. So we did, from the beginning, we knew that we would want to look at New Year's, for example. It's like, it's not the kind of event that's going to make everybody angry or sad or anything like that. It's just a time to come together, to become one with each other, actually to lift a glass and celebrate, all that. And we also knew that if there were great tragedies that occur, things like wars, if a war begins, what will our network of random number generators say to us? Will they just continue to be random? And the answer is no. They show divergences from what's expected when something like a war begins. And one of the most famous early events in this project was the attacks on 9/11, September 11, 2001. That's so long ago, and yet we are still feeling the reverberations from that. And this network of devices felt the reverberations, which were, I believe, a representation of the hearts and minds of, again, millions of people being deeply affected and synchronized in some sense to feel very much the same kinds of emotions. Just such a huge tragedy and a kind of harbinger of trouble in the world, such that maybe most of the people on the planet were thinking, oh my God, where are we going? And so things like once in a while I do something like a smaller event. A famous author in Sweden dies. This is a person that we might not know about in this country, but in Sweden it would be an occasion for a large number of people to come together, sharing the emotion, the feelings of loss, the emotions of kind of love and compassion in a way. But so sometimes very, in a way, mundane events, but just to try to cover the territory, a little mundane and a little outrageous, so we could basically ask the general question: what matters? What kinds of things matter to the global consciousness that we think we're seeing signs of? So we do things like when the stock market first hit 10,000, and probably most of the people listening don't even imagine that it was ever so small. The stock market has, kept growing and growing. I'm not sure it's an increase in value. Anyway, turns out that crossing the threshold of 10,000, which a lot of people celebrated, they thought, oh, marvelous. Nothing happened to the network. What we we often call them eggs because my son, whom I mentioned earlier, um, who was one of the two fantastic programmers who put this software together, he said, you know, what you're doing is a little bit like an EEG, but instead of electrodes on a scalp, you're putting these sensors around the planet. And so he said, maybe what you should call this is an electrodiagram, like instead of an electroencephalogram. And so EGG, electrodiagram, became a kind of, that was the first name the project had. Only later got this very sensible name of what the time of this project.
Dr. Nelson, so fascinating that, when there are these events, right, things that should be very random, like you said, these kind of coin flips became kind of very subtly structured. And this appeared over and over again. And I remember reading that, this is like a 1 in a trillion kind of odds that it's due to chance.
Right.
And so what does this mean? Some people who have never heard this before might be going, whoa, right? That's crazy. That's amazing. What does that actually mean?
Well, I think it means that we are connected. That's the name of my book, and for good reason. But we're connected, and I think this really is true. And there's lots of other evidence besides what comes from the GCP. We're connected, all of us, at an unconscious level. There's something like consciousness. We ask, what is consciousness? It's something that is bigger than we are. So we are participants in a great consciousness, I think, and we don't really know that. We can't feel the connection, except under special circumstances. Sometimes, if you get together with what people in Buddhism call a sangha and meditate together as a group, most people in those circumstances say sometimes it really feels like my meditation is our meditation. It is synchronized in a heartfelt manner. And we know from various other, research projects like the Global Coherence Initiative that Roland McCready runs. If you haven't talked to him, you should. That we're connected in an electromagnetic field manner, so much so that it's possible that the heart beat that two people each separately have become synchronized with each other. And that's partly because of the field, a true electromagnetic field that extends out from the heart. Each beat, there's something that's changing in the electromagnetic world, and it affects us. We affect each other. But the kind of unconscious connection I'm thinking that basically unites the world is faint and ethereal. It's not something we know how to access very well. The only kinds of tools we have are things like meditation and setting up our situation so that we can take advantage of love. If we do that, then we become more consciously connected. Anyway, I'd just like to add one point, which is what I most deeply believe we need to do, and that is to become conscious, to bring this unconscious connection that we have up into awareness so that we can become our potential. Each of us individually has an amazing set of possibilities. The potentials we all have are just magnificent, and we're held back somewhat by, I suppose, a little bit education, probably a lot of education, really, or lack of it, because children are already, they're already connected. They know, and they only learn eventually that no, this is Johnny's toy, not yours. It is our toy. And this is the thing that we most need to learn. We live in a connected universe, and it is a mistake for us to believe that we're not a part of that really amazing, interconnected humanity and life in general.
Thank you, Dr. Nelson. And I am really curious about this unifying field of consciousness because I do believe in the empowerment that you speak of. On an individual level, it's very empowering for us to become more conscious, right? So the way that I think of it in terms of becoming more conscious is to become conscious of our unconscious programming, of some unconscious, maybe stuck energy, like negative emotions, things like that from past events that we've repressed. And when we can release those things, when we can shift our thoughts and our emotions and radiate a different frequency out into the field, a higher, kind of more elevated emotional, higher frequency vibration out into the field, essentially feeding this field with the word that you talked about, love. Then what we do is really not only for ourselves and our own bodies, our own health, but also for the health of our families, our communities, for people who are leaders in organizations, the organization, and of course, the planet at large. And one of the things in the research that you have seen is that sometimes the randomness ceases to become completely random even before the events, which is very interesting as well, because some people might say, okay, well, we observe something as a result of the emotions, but I know that sometimes you have noticed some shifts even in advance of, for example, 9/11. So can you tell us about that and what that might mean, like this kind of premonition on a global level? That's mind-boggling.
Yeah, I think so. But it's the data show that this is the real thing that happens to scientific instruments that are designed to be random. They stop being quite so random. And sometimes they do it in such ways to tell us, give us another message about what you just said. The possibility that, like a regular human consciousness, it's possible for a global consciousness not only to exist and to be conscious in an unconscious way, still, but to even have these remarkable factors and features that individual humans' consciousness do. I once looked at the whole spectrum of emotions, going through all the events and saying, how much does this event represent fear, or how much fear is evoked in this event, how much compassion, and so on. A whole bunch of different emotions. And what we found ultimately is that the global consciousness is very much like a regular personal consciousness. It has the capacities to do things like feel anger and fear and love and compassion, and also may have the capacity to know the future just a little bit, to have a precognition or a premonition of the future. There's another, it isn't so widely known, but besides the 9/11 event, when the data started changing several hours before the first plane hit, that's pretty spectacular, and it's so clear in the data that we have to take it seriously. And so another example is earthquakes. We often have looked at big earthquakes, the kind that really cause a lot of damage and maybe kill people. My friend Peter Bancel decided to take a look at earthquakes all over the world for all of the data that we had, and he set a criterion of Richter magnitude 6, and that defines a big enough earthquake that will cause damage and kill people. And so there were, I believe, 600 of those, and about 100 were on land and 500 in the oceans. And he looked at the data for those in the oceans where nobody got hurt, maybe not even the fish. There was no pattern in the data. But for the earthquakes on land, which hurt people, there was a pattern that began early, something like 8 hours before the main temblor of the earthquake. The data started dropping down and reached the minimum point, and then exactly at the time of the main temblor of the earthquake, and then came back up again. So in other words, there was a pattern. It should have been like this. There was a pattern that kind of outlined or defined this momentous event in human consciousness space.
That is fascinating. So are they using that now as a potential predictor of earthquakes?
I don't think anybody is, but it's in principle possible too. Yeah. There are other kinds of things that that allow a little bit of prediction ahead of time. One of them is the animal behavior. You may have heard of this, but many animals behave oddly. They become agitated sometime well before earthquakes.
Yeah, they have that energetic sensitivity, vibrational sensitivity. I just came back actually from Kenya over the holidays and kind of saw that in real time, where there was some danger around, like a jaguar. You could see that the animals around, of course, some of them would run, some of them would just freeze. It was just very, very fascinating to see, even when they didn't have the visual of that. It's really, really amazing. And so one of the questions in the book that you asked, and it's a wonderful book, the book Connected, is why are we here? It was kind of a question that was brought up earlier on in the book. So what is your answer for that? Why might we be here?
I guess it's because we need to know about us. Now, that's a little bit maybe too flip, but I think that the best thing I can imagine is the explanation for our presence here is that the consciousness of the universe wanted to needs or wants somehow to see itself. So that's the self-awareness that we have as human beings. The animals are, some of our animals are also self-aware, but not like we are. We are questioning, curious creatures, and we are marvelous investigators. Once we get a question in mind, we work hard to try to answer it, and that the result of that is that we advance. We become more aware, at least in principle. And sometimes I think our advancements are really leaps backward, but that's only because we haven't got control of ourselves yet. And so we have a lot of bad habits that manifest when, in the same way as our artworks do. We also have bad, people who create destruction. I mean, the Ukrainian war, the war in Ukraine, I should say, is such a travesty and completely unnecessary. It was a creation of a few mad men, or maybe even only one, who had sufficient power to be able to bring in the whole populace of a country to do something awful.
And what I appreciate about your work, and I know you're also on the scientific advisory board of the Global Coherence Initiative, that work as well, is that empowerment piece, the research showing that we are in fact interconnected, in these invisible ways, and that when we become more aware of ourselves, more conscious, if we will, then we're at choice to shift or release some aspects of ourselves that are maladaptive. And in doing so, feeding the field with more love, and I believe bringing even more unity. And we see that when a number of people, right, are synchronized in feelings of elevated emotions, we see real shifts in the electromagnetic, right, measures of the earth, and of course in these random number generators, these eggs, and that brings a lot of hope, Dr. Nelson.
I hope so. I think it does. I mean, it's a rough world for most of us most of the time, and so we need these bright lights of possibility to be present for us. And I mentioned before what I think is our situation. We have tremendous potential to grow into, and we need encouragement to to do everything we can to allow ourselves to just blossom. This world and all the people in it have such beautiful, beautiful future. If we will only take the steps to move that direction. We don't have any choice but to move into the future anyway. But we do have a choice about what kind of future it will be. And it should be beautiful.
Yeah, and I believe it will be. And the evidence, like I said, that you and the team are building is very encouraging, right? And that coupled with tools, with how do we do this at the individual level, and so many techniques now out there, many of which are, kind of been taught on this podcast and so on by different experts. They are the how do we do this? How do we elevate our consciousness and therefore our social and global consciousness to bring us all back together.
Right. To bring us to our destiny. I mean, Teilhard de Chardin said, we think we're the pinnacle of evolution, and we are, except that it's not finished yet. There is this whole other step. And it's easy to imagine for somebody like me. I've been thinking about it. I probably read Teilhard 50 years ago. Anyway, it is so clear that we have this grand future right there. All we need to do is reach for it.
That's right. And for all of those people who are leaders in their families, in their communities, and their organizations that are hearing this, there is a responsibility for yourselves, to become more conscious and help your teams and everybody in your organization to do the same, so that we have that ripple effect. And so thank you from all my heart, Dr. Nelson. How can people learn more about your research, your tools, and how to get in touch with you?
Well, the simplest, I shouldn't say simple, the best organized way of learning more about my work and our work, there's a lot of people on the team, is the book Connected, which can be bought in Barnes and Noble, which hardly anybody does, but also from Amazon.
Yeah, I have it on Kindle. It's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah. And the website is interesting. It's global-mind.org. So it's pretty simple. Global Mind is with a dash. Global-mind.org. And if somebody has a question that can't be readily answered, they can write to me at rdnelson, rdnelson at Princeton.edu.
Well, with all my love, thank you, Dr. Nelson, for your precious time, your love, your just dedication to this work on behalf of all of us. And so really deep appreciation and continued well-being and joy for you and your family.
I would like to say the same for you. I love it that you are doing this kind of education. You're teaching people more about this potential that we have. And you are helping necessarily. By bringing awareness, you bring possibility. Thank you so much.
That's the hope. Thank you, Doctor.